Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai. Welcome from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to the fourth of the 2021 Outcome Mapping webinar series. Our first three webinars focused on outcome mapping itself, where it's come from, where it might be going, how it works, and a celebration of 20 years of outcome mapping. For our last three, we're kind of taking it a little bit wider, looking at the commonalities between outcome mappings and other actor-centered design and evaluation methodologies. And so it's a great way to kick off this one with the intersection between outcome mapping and a kind of systemic way of thinking about evaluation. And if we're talking systems, I don't think there's anyone better on the planet to talk about it than Bob Williams. He's a well-known evaluator and both thinks and writes about systems. Books like Wicked Systemic Evaluation and Wicked Problems give you an idea of not only what he thinks about, but what he's like. And he probably needs little introduction to most of you, but as it's kind of traditional when people say that, I'm going to introduce him anyway. Bob's an evaluator with years and years of experience. He's not an outcome mapping expert, but he's thought and written lots and lots about outcome mapping and outcome harvesting. He's an evaluator. He thinks systems and he works in systems. And my little anecdote about him, first time before I'd met him actually, I got involved in a presentation to the American Evaluation Association alongside him. And we traded emails. I was in India, he was in New Zealand, and we kind of worked out what we might say. And the deal was I was going to bring a messy story from an evaluation in Afghanistan, and Bob was going to provide all the intellectual capital and all the thinking, which is a great deal for me. As it transpired, I met Bob in Washington, DC, and we said, yeah, this is what we're going to do. And that night, the NGO from Afghanistan mailed me to say, no, please don't tell that story from Afghanistan. If you tell that in the USA, it may put lives at risk in Afghanistan. So a bit embarrassed that my humble contribution to it was now come to nothing. I approached Bob the next morning and said, Bob, well, we can't tell the story. And Bob said, that's all right. Let's just rejig it. Bought us the coffee, and we sat there in the lobby of the hotel and redesigned our workshop that morning and presented it that afternoon. So that's Bob. He thinks systems, he writes systems, and he walks the actual messy talk about complexity and emergence and surprises and all that. No problem to Bob. So without further ado, over in a ski lodge in the North Island of New Zealand, over to you, Bob. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora tātou, yeah. It's really great to start this discussion. I mean, the outcome mapping, outcome harvesting have been a long-standing interest. I've done lots of work with IDRC, and of course that's where outcome mapping had its early days. And I also worked very closely with Ricardo Wilson-Grau in developing his book on outcome harvesting. So although I wouldn't call myself a practitioner, I know quite a lot about the history. Jeph is correct that I'm actually sitting up on the side of a mountain, sadly in the pouring rain rather than the driving snow. And as a consequence of that, we thought it was best, given that although we may be in a physical lockdown in New Zealand or in some parts of New Zealand, it's very difficult to keep an entire ski lodge quiet for half an hour. So this is this next bit is going to be recorded. So I will kick off and there will be an introduction. And then once that recording is over, we'll come back to the sort of the real live me, Jeph, and hopefully you guys are still alive at the end of this as well. So anyway, let me just kick off by doing all the various bits of sharing screens, and we will start the presentation. Over the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the following things: what underpins systems practice, how to relate systems practice to evaluation practice, and how systemic practice can contribute to evaluation practice. That will lead to a discussion on where ideas from the system field can indeed contribute to evaluation as a whole. So here's what I'd like you to what I'd like you to have in mind as we work through the ideas that I'm going to present to you. How and where can systems ideas inform outcome mapping and outcome harvesting practice? It'll form the basis of our discussion after this presentation. But first off, let's start with what I mean by a systemic approach. Well, like evaluation, the systems field is really large, and there are many, many different systems and systemic approaches to problem solving. To give you some idea, here's a diagram of the systems field that was produced by one of its major figures, Ray Eisen. And he points out that it is just his conceptualization of the systems field. But I do find this diagram useful because on the left-hand part of the diagram, it shows you just how wide the range of intellectual traditions that the systems field draws on. And on the right-hand side, it shows how these have evolved into the very wide range of systems methods and methodologies. So what's the framework I use in systemic evaluation design? Some years ago, a group of systems and evaluation practitioners gathered together to identify what, in their view, underpinned all of those aspects of the many different systems approaches that you've seen that were particularly relevant to evaluation. And we came up with 3 aspects that have been quite widely adapted in various forms. The first aspect is that the evaluation fundamentally understands interrelationships. The second one is that it actively engages with multiple perspectives. And the third thing is that it reflects on the various boundary choices that the interventions and the evaluation makes. To put that into more accessible language, it really basically answers these 3 questions. What's the reality we are dealing with? How do people interpret that reality? And given that there are many millions of realities and many millions of interpretations of that reality, in order for us to actually do something, we have to draw some boundaries. So we reflect on the boundaries to decide what is feasible and desirable to do. And of course, everything interacts. If you change one of these, you are likely to influence or change the other. So that's systems, but let me be clear about what I regard as evaluation. When I refer to an evaluation, this is what I'm talking about. Basically, without some explicit process of assessing merit, worth, or significance, I don't consider it an evaluation. It may be good program planning, it may be really good research, but it isn't an evaluation. Another thing I want to get you to understand is that when I'm actually applying systems ideas to evaluation, I play an important mind game. And that mind game regards the evaluation client as the intervention, not as a particular key stakeholder, and especially not the commissioner of the evaluation. Now, if you're unable to play this mental trick, you'll find that you really will struggle to apply systems ideas to your evaluation. And you'll see why later, but you need to understand this presentation with that particular idea in your head. Let me also be clear that the evaluation design is not, for me, a one-off thing that is done before the fieldwork happens during that dreaded inception report stage. Rather, it's a continuous process that starts way before any evaluator even knows about the evaluation and lasts until way after the evaluator has picked up the check and left the scene. Now, that's obviously true in evaluation approaches such as developmental evaluation, but I also challenge anyone who's used any evaluation approach to put their hand on their heart and categorically say that nothing in the evaluation changed during the evaluation itself. And we also need to accept there's a lot of design work that goes on long before we arrive on the scene, and the impacts of the evaluation and the design around the impact, ensuring that the evaluation has an impact, continue on, and indeed ought to continue on, long after we've left. So, what are the key components of systems or a systemic evaluation design? And here are the ones that are important to me. Now, of course, they're not all the aspects of evaluation design. I'm just focusing on those that I believe can be informed by systems approaches. And from that list, I want to highlight 4 things from a systems or a systemic point of view. Firstly, you'll see that both the intervention and the evaluation have multiple purposes. Again, I'll explore that in more detail when talking about multiple perspectives and framings. Secondly, I distinguish between the focus, the framing, and the scope of an evaluation. I'll talk more about framing later, but the focus is what generally we would call the evaluation. The scope is the relevant context within which the situation we are evaluating floats, like, things in a soup. And finally, I highlight evaluation consequences. It's one of those sort of interesting contradictions of evaluation practice that while we put everybody through hell constructing interventions, the interventions theories of change around the consequences of the intervention effectively, but while we talk about evaluation use, we hardly ever talk about evaluation consequences. I have yet to see a theory of change of the evaluation itself, which of course is an intervention within intervention. And finally, you'll see that there's no mention of method or methodology. That's because in my book, the choice of evaluation methods and methodologies is not part of the evaluation design, but a product of the evaluation design. So, how does all this list relate to those 3 aspects of a systemic approach that I described earlier? So, here is one way of understanding this. Now, I don't have time to go through how I do all of this in detail. Instead, I'm going to focus on a few of the items that I believe particularly important to outcome harvesting and outcome mapping, and show you a few methods that I use to address them. So let's start with interrelationships. Firstly, let's deal with the what of interrelationships. What kinds of interrelationships tend to be covered by systemic approaches? Now, this admittedly long list is gleaned from a whole range of systems approaches. The items in blue are areas that tend to be highly important in evaluation. Now, of course, we have to draw boundaries around these things. So let's look at some of the areas around which there are some systems approaches that deal with kind of groups of these particular aspects that interrelate. In this particular case, they're grouped into a sort of collection of 5 or so different components, and in what's called viable systems, we look at how balanced or unbalanced these things are to each other. To what extent does coordination overwhelm strategy development, or how management overwhelms delivery? And here's another way in which we can focus on particular interrelationships for particular purposes. This is taken from activity systems, and what it does is explore how rules, roles, and tools combine to produce or influence activities that reach some kind of common goal. Now, diagrams are commonly used in systemic approaches to describe how components of a situation interrelate. You've just seen 2 diagrams, but these are the more common ones. And these diagrams tend to fall into 3 categories. Diagrams like these are often called rich pictures, and they seek to explore the sort of messiness of an entire situation so that you can begin to identify what aspects of the situation to focus on. Diagrams such as influence diagrams seek to give a moment-in-time snapshot of how specific aspects of a situation are influencing each other. And then there is the wide variety of diagrams that seek to reveal the dynamic properties of those interrelationships. These are often called causal diagrams. So that's interrelationships, and a quick refresh on what aspects of evaluation design I use them for. So now, perspectives. Perspectives is all about the different ways in which an intervention can be understood. Now, I want to stress this is not about different opinions about the same understanding, but different lenses through which an intervention can be viewed. And one of the really important ways of understanding the importance of perspectives is to think about framing. Now, framing is basically exploring the different ways that an intervention or a particular perspective can be described. Now, I generally do this by getting people to use the phrase something to do with health, something to do with economic wealth, something to do with opportunities for women. So, for instance, take a needle exchange program. A needle exchange program is where drug users can exchange dirty needles for clean ones. These can be considered from a health framing, in other words, something to do with the reduction of HIV transmission, or from a safety framing, something to do with drug users being able to score drugs without being hassled, or even an economics framing, something to do with the effect of house prices or rents in the area where drug users gather. Now, the merit, worth and significance of a program would be assessed differently through each of these particular framings and actually assessed using different criteria. And this is one of the reasons why I use the mental trick of the intervention being the client, since the commissioner of the evaluation will inevitably tend to have just one perspective on a program. So the evaluation may conclude that the program is successful through that lens, but at the same time could also be much more damaging when seen through another lens. So how do I arrive at these framings and criteria? To assess this and discover the various perspectives or framings, I use a particular form of stakeholder analysis. Now, notice an important difference to most stakeholder analyses. I start with stakeholder roles. And the reason for that is that a person can occupy multiple roles. So for instance, if we take an agricultural production example, one person could be a farmer, a village leader, or a consumer. In fact, how people negotiate these roles heavily influences the results of an intervention and assessments of its merit, worth, and significance. So how do I do this? Well, first, I get an understanding of what the stakeholder role actually is. Something or someone affected by or affects someone or something that is of interest to us. Once I've done that, I help construct something along the following table. I get people to list the various stakeholder roles. I then get people to identify what that role is influenced by. In this particular example, I've only given one particular influence, but of course there could be many, and influence maps can help me develop that. Similarly, I get people to understand how that role influences other aspects of the situation. Once I've done that, I can begin to draw on the motivations and interests that inform each role and the dynamics of that particular role. And that helps me identify the criteria. Now, for me, this particular stage is one of the most important parts of the application of systems ideas to evaluation practice. Evaluators frequently either ignore the importance of criteria or just grab existing criteria such as the DAC criteria or those from the evaluation commissioner without a great deal of thought. Now, in this example, the criteria are identified from the ground up, from the actual intervention itself and the different perspectives that people bring to the evaluation and assess its worth. As demonstrated by the needle in exchange example, you'll find they're often not the same criteria as those identified by the commissioning agency. So hence, it's actually a good idea to begin to involve them and other stakeholders in this particular process. In fact, it helps to have them involved in all three of the various methods in this particular talk. What I can then do is begin to understand and work out framing by exploring the relationship between motivations and interests and criteria to begin to address issues of something to do with affordability, something to do with productivity, something to do with personal status, something to do with low food prices. each of those will have a completely different set of criteria if you're trying to reach an assessment of value or worth. So here we go. Engaging with multiple perspectives helps with evaluation focuses or framings, evaluation questions, evaluation purposes, and all the other things on that particular list. It's a very, very important part of the evaluation design. But what I want to do now is explore the issue of boundaries, since I believe it is one of the most important areas of the application of systems ideas to evaluation design. It's a common misperception that systems approaches are about including everything, the whole holism thing. In fact, the reverse is true. Systemic approaches are about being very smart, deliberative, and well-informed about what to exclude. And that's because everything we do, as I said earlier on, is bounded in some ways. Every intervention, every evaluation. It's impossible to view and understand every single interrelationship at every available scale, and it's impossible to accommodate every single perspective. To be able to do anything, like introduce and manage an intervention, boundaries have to be drawn. Our job is to make some kind of, or enable some kind of judgment of value or worth or significance of those boundary choices. Now, these boundaries can be boundaries of space, time, purpose, cost, control, knowledge, values, perspectives, and many other things. But how an intervention draws its boundaries and where it draws them will hugely affect, as I said earlier on, its merit, value, and significance. Thus, deliberating on those boundary decisions within intervention is a critical part of an evaluation. But as with interrelationships and perspectives, any intervention takes hundreds and hundreds of boundary decisions. Which ones should we focus on in an evaluation? I tend to explore 4 key boundary decisions when designing an evaluation. These components of a system are taken from the critical systems tradition, and they focus on the significance of 4 areas of boundary decision: purpose, control, knowledge, and legitimacy. Now, purpose, these are the decisions that are made about the purposes of the intervention, who did and did not, or what did and what did not benefit from those purposes, and how those benefits were identified. In terms of control, these decisions are made about who managed the delivery of those purposes to those beneficiaries, but also who had the power of veto over the intervention, and just where that boundary between management and control lied. The successful management and control of an intervention requires information. It's impossible to use all the information available, or indeed all the relevant knowledge systems that are available. So decisions around the boundary between the knowledge used and the knowledge marginalized are critically important. And finally, interventions need to gain legitimacy in order to survive and deliver on their purpose. They need to be able to support the claim, this is or was the right thing to do. So even if an intervention is well managed, well informed, well controlled, and with a good purpose, those who are, or whose beliefs are, disadvantaged or marginalized or harmed by an intervention can challenge that claim. And if they have sufficient practical, ethical, and political leverage, they can indeed prevent the intervention achieving its purpose. And again, evaluation has something to say about that. So, these boundary issues clearly affect all aspects of the design, but especially its focus, its scope, both boundary choices, criteria is a boundary choice, and the evaluation questions. So now we've covered all 3 systemic components and their relationship with specific aspects of evaluation design. What I want to do now is focus on 2 critically important aspects of evaluation design: evaluation questions and evaluation criteria. So first, evaluation questions, because all 3 aspects of a systemic evaluation informs evaluation practice. In terms of interrelationships questions, there are 2. How important are the nature, or is the nature of the relationships between all of these, or a selection of these various components? And how appropriate are those relationships? In terms of perspectives, there are four main questions I ask. What are the important stakeholder roles? What are the important motivations and values? What are the key framings that reflect those motivations? And what are the relevant criteria by which to assess whether those particular activities within those framings had merit, value, or worth? And there is a whole bunch of questions around boundary choices. In terms of purpose, were appropriate decisions made by the right people about the purposes of the intervention? Did the right people benefit from those purposes? Were the benefits identified in the right way? In terms of control, were appropriate decisions made about who managed the delivery of those purposes? Did the right people have control over the intervention? Did the decision over the boundary between management control significantly affect the delivery of the purpose? In terms of knowledge, was the boundary between knowledge used and knowledge marginalized appropriate? In terms of legitimacy, was it indeed the right thing to do? For whom? And how well did the intervention manage the consequences of the boundary choice between those who were going to benefit from the purpose and the intervention and those who did not? But wait, there's more. Remember, evaluation itself is an intervention and makes its own boundary decisions. So these four aspects of an intervention are also necessary to apply to the evaluation itself: the purposes, the beneficiary, control, knowledge, and legitimacy. So here are some questions that we need to draw in about those boundary choices. My apologies if this seems a bit repetitive, but take close notice of how these questions, when applied to the evaluation approach itself, are subtly but importantly different. There are two main interrelationship questions. How important is the nature of the evaluation relationships between these aspects? How appropriate are the evaluation relationships? In terms of perspectives, what are the important evaluation stakeholder roles? What are the important motivations and values of those various roles? What are the key evaluation framings that reflect these motivations? Think of the three common ones: accountability, program improvement, learning. Three very common different framings. What are the relevant evaluation criteria that match those framings? If we were assessing from a learning perspective, that would be different from an accountability perspective. In terms of purpose, when it comes to boundary choices and boundary decisions, what should be the purposes of the evaluation? Who or what should benefit from those purposes? Who should make those decisions? And what's the right way to identify the benefits of the evaluation? In terms of control, what appropriate decisions should be made about who manages the delivery of the evaluation purposes? Who are the right people to have control over the evaluation, the right of veto? And where should the appropriate boundary between the management and control of the evaluation? What should be the appropriate boundary between the knowledge used by the evaluation and the knowledge marginalized or ignored by the evaluation? And in the end, was it the right evaluation to do? For whom? And how well should the evaluation manage the consequences of the boundary between those who benefited from the evaluation and those who did not? And finally, the whole issue of evaluative criteria. So here are some questions of the evaluation in terms of its decisions around criteria. So do the criteria specifically relate to the key interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries of both the intervention and the evaluation? Who decided the criteria, and were they the right people to do so? Do you actually have the appropriate knowledge to assess the criteria? And finally, who or what do the criteria marginalize? Criteria about who's in and who's out. So who is potentially, or what is potentially harmed or ignored or marginalized by those boundary choices around criteria. Okay, time for a quick summing up. Here are the three main aspects of an evaluation that the application of systems ideas that I've focused on. To what extent does it understand interrelationships? To what extent does it engage with multiple perspectives? And to what extent does the evaluation reflect on boundaries of both the evaluation and the intervention itself? And here are the ways in which particular components or aspects of an evaluation design interact or relate to those three particular areas. So what? Well, let's go back to the reflection question that I posed right at the beginning of this talk. How and where can systemic practice usefully inform outcome mapping and outcome harvesting? Over to you guys.
Thank you, Bob. That was fantastic. Very, very clear, and so many ideas in it. And I love the idea of applying systemic thinking to the evaluation, or presumably the design as well as to the intervention. I'm going to misuse my position here as the host by taking the opportunity to ask the first question, Bob. I'm fascinated by boundaries, and I'd love to hear your perspective on how outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, how these approaches deal with or don't deal with boundaries in the way you think may be appropriate.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting a little sign that's saying that my internet connection may be a bit unstable, but we'll plow through. Yeah, it's a good question. I started off being really interested in the perspectives issues and framings and that sort of stuff, because I think it's an area that, on the whole, evaluation is very weak on. We tend to just take one framing and go with it because that's what we're told to do. But that fairly quickly moved on to this idea of, well, kind of a framing is a sort of a boundary. We're leaving things out. So I got really interested in that area. So yeah, and I've thought quite a bit about it in terms of what that means in particular evaluation approaches. On the whole, I think evaluation doesn't obviously draws boundaries all the time. On the whole, it's not particularly reflective on those boundary choices consciously. I mean, there's lots of water cooler conversations, of course. And there are lots of conversations about, should we talk with these people or should we talk with those people? But they're atomized in some way. Whereas what you might have got the idea from this presentation is that actually these are much broader questions rather than specific things about, what kind of interview style and what size our sample should be, which are all boundary choices. It's easier to inevitably to look at the weaknesses rather than the strengths, and I think one of the major weaknesses of outcome harvesting, and in fact it was an argument, literally arguments that Ricardo and I used to have, was that the boundary of outcome harvesting is not challenged. The fundamental root, as it were, to mix the metaphors, of outcome harvesting is intended use for intended users. Is that intended use correct? Are those the right users, right? Because they will then determine, where you spread your harvest. I mean, the metaphor of a harvest is really interesting because, you can only harvest your field, the field that you own, the field that you have permission on. You can only harvest at the right time and in the right way. Different kinds of produce actually need to be harvested at different times. And I've always felt uncomfortable that somehow the idea is that once you've got a bunch of people who say we're going to use it in this way, that determines the harvest. It was never. There is nothing inherently in the discourse around outcome harvesting that requires you to deliberate overtly and consciously about that. When it comes to outcome mapping, I mean, outcome mapping is not, the commentaries around outcome mapping and the use of boundaries is pretty much the same as the rest of the evaluation field. But I do think that actually, because of this notion of boundary partners in outcome mapping, there is one area where you actually have identified and you do deliberate consciously on a very important boundary. And it's a boundary of the intervention. And it's a really interesting boundary because it's actually the boundary between management and control, right? You use the word influence, and there's quite a bit of discussion within the critical systems field that these boundaries, and in fact, in a slightly longer version of the presentation that I gave, that I actually say that some boundaries are thin, some boundaries are thick, some boundaries are porous. And it seems to me that one of the intriguing things about outcome mapping is that it's got a very wide boundary and it calls it influence, right? So it's not absolutely in control, and it's not absolutely in management. It's somewhere in between the two. But even so, it's a boundary choice. Somebody somewhere decides what the influence means, how it differs from management, how it differs from control, whether that boundary choice is appropriate for whom, and what are the implications of saying these are the boundary partners rather than those are the boundary partners.
Thanks, Bob. As usual,
I could go on for hours, you know that.
Lots for me to think about. We did a evaluation in Cambodia with Indigenous people, and the metaphor was going out in the jungle and finding what there wasn't your own field. So it's depends who you're using. I'm going to invite Ricky Kuswardono from, I think from Indonesia, Ricky. Ricky, unmute yourself and ask your question live. He's got a great question there. Or Simon, do you need to unmute him?
Hello, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to asking. What I know about system thinking, I know about the causal loop diagram is for the system dynamic model. So when we try to understand a system, usually we not put we as a program intervention put in the system as intervention, and then should we make put that as a baseline before the program intervention, and then after the program intervention, then we can evaluate how the system can change. That's my questions.
Okay, there are two things I would probably respond to that. One of them is system dynamic modeling is a relatively small part of the systems field, right? It's the part that most people are familiar with, but it is a very small part of the systems universe. It is frequently misused by people who really don't understand it. Having said that, I have used diagramming processes in my work to allow people to explore using any form of systemic approach, but a kind of before and after. But I think one of the things to understand, and this comes also from the complexity field as well, is that the notion of counterfactuals and baselines are really unreliable, and that there are considerable risks in using systems ideas as a before and after. And I could go into some detail as to why, but there's no reason why not, but be careful. Is that okay? Ricky, did that answer your question? It was a good one.
Thanks, Bob. That's great. We've got a couple of interesting questions out there from Simon, but Simon, could you unmute yourself and ask the one about management you've got in there?
Yeah, it was just what you were saying earlier, Bob, about the boundary between control and management. I didn't quite understand that. What do you mean by management here, and how does it relate to control?
Oh, actually, I have a terrible problem with that word, but I can't think of a word that means not control. And in fact, within various systems processes, the word management, it doesn't mean the same as capital M management as a tier. It basically means the handling of resources, right? Anything that involves the handling of resources within your system, it would be regarded as management. The things that would not, in the definition that I'm using, right? Outside of that are two areas that relate to control. One of them is the people or the institutions that can make the system cease to exist, right? Very common in issues to do with accountability, right? Although I really don't think that accountability has a place within systemic inquiries, but we can go into that sort of conversation. But they're the people who have the power to stop the system existing, all right? So that's one. The second area that is around control are the externalities, the things over which you really, they're givens, all right? So you have to operate the system within that particular given. Laws, right? Right? You have to run, you can't manage laws in that sense. They control you, and they control your ability to use those resources, right? I mean, if I wanted to be technical, if you think of realist evaluation and that notion of context management and context, mechanism, and outcome, it's the sort of, it's the M space. But you're right, management is not the right word, but I can't think of an alternative word.
So I'm wondering how it relates to...
Is that clear, Simon?
Yeah, I'm wondering how it relates to the idea and outcome mapping of the sphere of influence, where we differentiate between the sphere of control and the sphere of influence, where in the sphere of control are the decisions you can make about the resources that you've got. You know, you have control over those decisions, which interventions you run, which events, which outputs you produce, where you invest your resources.
And again, you know, there's this famous definitions that words, sorry, this famous comment that words don't have in definitions, only uses. What you call control, in my diagram, I called management, right? What you call a sphere of influence, right? What I'm saying is a boundary, a wide boundary, and then it's all that stuff that lies outside, I'm calling control. It's actually confusing. It should be things that are out of it. Well, and those are the things that will close a project down, right? You know, even if you're having incompetent management and considerable influence, if you can't get that legitimacy, you're done, you're finished. Because ultimately, the resources are actually externally provided in some way.
So there are external factors that the intervention itself doesn't have any control on. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, there will be things over which there will be institutions, in the broader sense of the word, that will tell you you cannot exist any longer, right? The classic one is your funder, right? If the funder pulls the plug, the system may not exist. So they actually have the ultimate control. Now, one of the arguments in in management science is, you know, kind of these notions of responsibility and accountability, is that actually when you design a program, you have to make a decision somewhere along the program as who has management responsibility and who has control responsibility, right? In some cases, it's called devolution, all right? In highly devolved interventions, that line is quite close to the delivery arm. In highly centralized interventions, that's quite at a high level. It might be, you know, in Britain rather than Rwanda or Thailand. That's a conscious choice that's made. And I rarely see that explicitly addressed in evaluations. It's often hinted at, and it often becomes an issue. But one of the things that these particular debates within evaluation and in explorations and investigations around management and control bring up those issues quite significantly. And it's really hard for evaluators to get involved in that because you're walking smack into the politics. But it's inevitable because somebody somewhere controls every intervention. Somebody somewhere can make it stop. Now, is that line in the right place? That's an evaluative judgment. And evaluators very rarely do that because they'll never get another job.
Thanks, Bob. I think walking smack into the politics that's what evaluation is about, isn't it? Simon, while you're in a role, you've got another question there, Simon.
Yeah, I was just wondering, to what extent can we just replace the word evaluation with monitoring and still make sense of this?
You could try. I tend not to distinguish between evaluation and monitoring. That's just a personal thing. To me, monitoring provides particular data for particular decisions, and those decisions are still evaluative decisions, right? I mean, C. West Churchman, who invented critical systems, essentially, was a professor of management. And his argument was that management was not a technocratic, this was his big argument with Harvard, was not a technocratic thing, it was practical ethics. It was the application of ethical practice. That's what management is. So even in monitoring, how well are we doing? Where are we doing? Are we running out of leaflets? You still have to ask your question, well, are those leaflets worth reprinting? That's an evaluative decision. But I'm a bit idiosyncratic when it comes to that. People talk about evaluation and monitoring as quite distinct things, and I can understand the purposes are different, but both of them involved evaluative judgment.
I always think that one of the things that outcome mapping is trying to do is bring.
So yeah, the short answer is yes. Why not? My short answer to your question is why not try? You know.
Yeah. No, and I think that's what outcome mapping tries to do is to bring that evaluative thinking into your monitoring to actually make it more.
I think you're right.
What you're doing is evaluation, but it's not hiring an external evaluator for 6 months piece of work. It's an ongoing practice.
Well, Mike Scriven always said that evaluation was the second skill that human beings developed. The first skill was observation, and the second skill was evaluation. I see a mammoth. Is it good to eat? That's an evaluative question. So yeah, you're right.
Thanks, Bob and Simon. This conversation could probably go on forever, but we've got one in there from Julie Adkins. Julie, could you unmute yourself and ask that, please?
Hello. Yeah, I'm really interested in the interrelationship part of this evaluative focus, but in my mind, it's something which I can't unpack very easily. So I'm trying to figure out what are the key elements. And when you're looking at interrelationships, You're thinking about cause and effect, you're thinking about power relations, but what do we see when we look at interrelationships? It's something which to me is like a box.
Were you here at the beginning of the talk?
Yes.
Julie?
Maybe I didn't catch it very well.
Because there was the list of things that I had gleaned from various systems practices, and it's a long list, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's everything from kind of the interrelationship between motivations, the interrelationship between resources, and so on. I think the difficult thing is not what are we looking for, but how do we decide what we look for and what we don't look for? And again, that's a boundary choice, and we deliberate on that. There will be certain projects where the relationships between structures are really, really important. I used to do a lot of organizational development work, and the relationship between motivations of people in work were the critical thing, right? The structures didn't make any difference at all. So I think it's very, what I do is I have that list available as a checklist to say, okay, within this particular situation, where do I use my professional judgment and experience, and those of the people that I'm working with, to work out which are the ones that we really should focus on, because you can't focus on them all. And you certainly can't focus on them all at every single scale, from the atom to the universe, you know.
Yeah, thank you.
And incidentally, power is an incredibly important concept that actually the systems field has often been criticized for ignoring. But there are, debates these days in terms of feminist systems theory and critical systems approaches that really head, if you're interested in that, head straight to those particular areas, and I can provide some references if you're interested, Julie.
That's top of my list.
Thanks, Julie.
Thought it might be.
Well, almost as a follow-on to that, I see outcome mapping as, personally, I think, quite strong on perspectives, because by choosing boundary partners, it forces us to think about, we have to get into UN offices and talk to kids in the streets of Nairobi and understand from their perspective why they behave, what their motivation for behaving the way the way they do, what is their motivation, and then we have to think, what can we do to alter that? What's your spin on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. As long as you understand the distinction that I make about opinions and framings, right? Or opinions and perspectives. For me, perspectives is about how you look at the same thing, not your opinion of the same thing. Are you looking at it through health spectacles? Are you looking at it through youth opportunity spectacles? Are you looking at community safety spectacles, right? And so in a sense, what I'm saying is that it's that evaluation, I think, generally speaking, is quite good when it comes to perspectives. What it's not, where it doesn't quite go to the next the next level by saying, well, when we group these perspectives together, what are the worldviews that are that we're encountering here? And then thinking back, well, within those worldviews, what criteria are they using to judge the worth of this intervention, right? And this is where I come back to the intervention is the client, not the person who commissioned the evaluation. The person who commissioned the evaluation may be interested in youth justice, but actually the real worth of that particular intervention had nothing to do with youth justice, unless you understood that it was capable of having different framings with different motivations. You would miss that particular, the value of that particular intervention. And indeed, the funder who is interested primarily in youth justice may close the project down.
Interesting. Thanks.
Is that a reasonable answer?
Yeah, we can argue.
So yes, no, maybe.
Better later. Yeah, that's great. And Ricky, you've got another question.
No doubt we will. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, because this I just the question is just crossed in my mind.
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, in the systemic approach that we can know about how one actor become a very influenced than other actors. In outcome mapping, we work with boundary partners. The question is, can we use that systemic approach as to choose boundary partners? But another question is this actor, the actor is the right boundary partner? That's my question.
Let me unpick that. This is really, really good stuff. I think there are two questions. The answer is yes, right? But let me expand on that. I think there are two dynamics going on here. One of them is it the right boundary? Right, okay, I'll remove the word right. For whom is that the right boundary? All right. And having satisfied ourselves that that may be the most appropriate boundary, who is the most appropriate boundary partner to reflect the interests of that boundary? Is that okay? So yes, definitely. There would be a slightly different set of questions. It would be fun actually to work on that. But I just think there are two stages to that particular argument. So to repeat myself, what are the most appropriate boundaries here, and who are the most appropriate people to reflect that boundary? And it's interest. No, I won't go in. I was about to make the thing even more complicated. We can talk about that offline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thanks, Ricky. That was a great question.
Thank you, Ricky, and thank you, Bob. I see we're getting pretty close to the end of the hour here. So just to keep the time on, Bob, thank you very much. Great presentation and so many interesting ideas for all of us to take away. And thank you all to everyone who's logged into this. Great to see you here. Simon, I'll just ask you to unmute yourself and tell us about the other webinars coming up on OMLC.
Actually, before you do that, can I just say one more thing?
Sure, Bob.
People ask me what can I have the screen? I just want to show you one more slide because it's an important one. Let me just go to the next slide. Of course, this is where things go completely. There we go. It's this slide here. All right. People always ask me, how do we start on this stuff? All right. And those are the pieces of advice that I give people. Start with something that interests you. Use it when it would add something useful. For instance, deciding boundary partners. Use it in a safe place with people who are willing to collaborate with you. Don't take chances. Low risk, medium reward first. There are times when some of the systems questions that you ask could really change your relationship with the key stakeholders, and just be careful with that. And don't be purist, and have some fun. And if you're interested, there are a bunch of books, but whatever. You can find those on the net. Okay, thanks guys for that extra couple of minutes. Nigel.
Fantastic.
Nigel? Bob. Simon, where did Nigel come from?
That's a good English name.
No idea.
Fantastic, Bob. And for advice for any of you out there, if you get a chance to be at a big conference with Bob, take it. He's pretty adaptable. Simon, tell us about OMLC, what we've got coming.
Yeah, so you should see that slide with the next webinar dates. Can you see that? Can we nod?
Yep.
So we've got 2 more webinars coming up, one in October, one in November. You will see the registration links in an email I sent around yesterday, but also on the website, on the link on the slide there. So the next one is realist evaluation meets outcome mapping. What are ways to probe outcomes in more depth?
Oh,
And this is looking at a case of mental health intervention in India, and we'll be exploring how they used outcome mapping alongside other approaches. And then in November, there's gender and equity transformative outcome mapping. This is drawing on work by Heidi Scheffer and Sonal Zaveri, who have been doing some research around how to orient outcome mapping towards gender and equity transformation more explicitly than it usually is. So join us for those 2 webinars. We look forward to it.
And Simon, I
if you
think
have any
we've got
questions that didn't get answered, feel free to email into the outcome mapping learning community.
And Simon, we've got a training coming up too. Do you want to quickly tell us about that?
We do have a training. We have an annual training. Last year it was online. This year it will be online again. It's going to be starting in November, running for 6 weeks with 2 sessions. For 6 sessions over 3 weeks. And we'll be launching that later this week. So you'll be able to see an announcement and all the materials for that event.
Thank you, Simon. And thank you so much, Bob. That was fantastic. And you can go back to thinking about skiing now. And thank you to all of you who've logged in. Fantastic to see you, and hope to see you at some of the other webinars.